Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe, followers, likes, double tap.
Welcome to the 817 podcast. Today, Jimmy and I get to sit down with Cameron Cushman, the Director of Innovation Systems at the University of North Texas Health Science Center here in Fort Worth. He is also the host of Innovate Fort Worth podcast, which is my favorite local podcast because it really highlights entrepreneurs who are doing some really cool things locally that you may not have heard of before his show. Also, he's the organizer of Global Entrepreneurship Week here in Fort Worth, which is November 16th through the 20th. It's the third year, but this year it's 100% virtual, and they're going to have a ton of sessions with national speakers, people from Silicon Valley, policymakers in DC, and a bunch of cool sessions. I mean, one of the sessions I learned about was about how to make money with a drone. So I'm telling you, if you're looking to start a business, looking to learn about entrepreneurship, wanting to know where's the capital at, this is the week to learn those kind of things. So definitely check it out at gewfortworth.com. But today we get to talk to Cameron about the Fort Worth ecosystem and what's it missing and what do we need to do in order to grow as a city among other cities in our state, but then also across the country. So here's Cameron Cushman. Hey, Cameron, thanks so much for coming on 817 and sharing the amazing work. Big fan of Innovate Fort Worth and the podcast. I feel like you were one of the first to really represent Fort Worth in a podcast. And so kudos to that. Just shows kind of how innovation is in your blood and also in the work you do. So please share with our people, our listeners, who you are, what work you do, and also just kind of what gets you excited about Fort Worth.
Very good. Well, thanks for having me on, guys. I love what you guys are doing too. And I love that you guys are bringing local news to the forefront in a new way. A lot of our old media outlets are dying and changing, and I love what you guys are up to. So a little bit about me. I'm born and raised in Fort Worth, so long time Fort Worthian. Went to Texas A&M for school, studied political science, which took me to D.C. So I worked in D.C. for about 6 years. That's where I got my first taste of entrepreneurship and innovation. And that led me to a job at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. Not on my radar at all, but they are kind of the premier foundation for entrepreneurship in the country. It's about a $2 billion foundation, and got to do some really cool stuff while I was there. Most of all, just learned about entrepreneurship and what it takes to grow a company and really to build an ecosystem around entrepreneurs to fuel that sector of economic growth. And then I did that for about 5 years. I had multiple roles while I was there. Started a little thing called 1 Million Cups, which took off beyond anybody's wildest dreams. And then came back to Fort Worth about 7 years ago. Took a job in the private sector and did that for a while. Was doing sales and marketing for a healthcare company in East Fort Worth. But realized that entrepreneurship was really my passion. And so for about the last almost 3 years now, I've been working at the UNT Health Science Center in Fort Worth, and have been trying to build the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Fort Worth. It was interesting when I first moved back to town and I started talking about this stuff, people looked at me like I was crazy. They had no idea what to do with me. And I was talking about some of the Kauffman research and just some of my experiences about helping to build the entrepreneurial community there in Kansas City. And it was like Fort Worth wasn't ready for me or something. So I took that job in the private sector, and then 3 years later had some of the same conversations with the same people, and something had changed. I still can't quite put a finger on it, but all of a sudden everybody wanted to talk about what I was doing and the research that I was talking about, and how can we get more of that, whatever that is, in Fort Worth. And so that led to a role at the Health Science Center, where I get to just help build the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Fort Worth. And as far as I'm concerned, I got the greatest job in Fort Worth. So
I love it. And so tell me what does kind of work look like there at UT Health Science Center when it talks about managing the entrepreneurship ecosystem? And I'm also curious, why are they so curious to also be involved in curating that? That seems like a very unique position and use of R&D funds for for a health science center. So can you kind of bridge the gap there and kind of explain that work and what that looks like?
Absolutely. But let me start by zooming way out. So if you think about economic development, right, how we grow our economy, to way oversimplify it, there's basically three buckets that falls in, right? You recruit other companies or talent to move to Fort Worth, right? Existing companies. you retain the companies that you've got, right? I need to expand. I need to add a second location. I need to hire more people. I need a business loan. I need a tax incentive so I can open up that next facility, or I need a zoning change or whatever that is. And then the third one is to kind of grow your own bucket, right? Entrepreneurship. Who are the companies that don't exist today that are going to get started tomorrow, next month, next year? And then how do we as a community come around and support them? So I focus squarely in that third bucket. And frankly, Fort Worth is doing great on the other two buckets. I mean, you guys talk on your show all the time about new companies that are moving to Fort Worth, and we've got a great track record, and the future is really bright, especially as California just continues to empty out and they're all moving to Texas. But my role, yes, it doesn't make any sense on paper why a guy at a medical school should be doing this kind of work. But it really, I draw the direct line back to President Mike Williams at the Health Science Center. He is a Fort Worth native, alum of the school, and just saw a need that wasn't being filled in Fort Worth, that people weren't talking about this, we weren't thinking about this. And the way I describe it is that, Fort Worth is now the 13th largest city in the country, and the resources and the ecosystem around entrepreneurship has just not kept up with that really rapid growth. And so he brought me in, we had a conversation, and he said, hey, I think we need someone like you to help us do this work in Fort Worth. We're a public institution, economic development, innovation, research, that's very much a part of our mission. And we don't see anybody else really leading this in Fort Worth. Would you be interested in kind of taking a role? Because you've clearly done this in other places. And so I'm always very careful to say, like, I don't own the ecosystem. I don't run the ecosystem. I don't lead it. But where there's opportunity, we want to jump in and say, we see a gap. Let's go fill it, right? Find a need and fill it. And that's really what we're trying to do.
I love it. Well, I would love to kind of talk about where do you feel Fort Worth is? I feel like there's a lot of positive news around Fort Worth and the success we're doing, but it seems like the research and the things you share kind of shows the opportunity for growth in the city and where we can improve. And so what is the state of Fort Worth and our startup ecosystem compared to other states across the cities across the country and even in the state of Texas?
Yeah, great question. And I would say we've had some tremendous success. I mean, if you go all the way back, Fort Worth has had some tremendous, innovative, cutting edge companies that have been developed here. Radio Shack, hydraulic fracturing, the ice cream drumstick was invented in Fort Worth. I mean, these are like transformative type of things, right? But we have that history of innovation and entrepreneurship. But if you also look at a lot of the companies who have left Fort Worth recently, Pier 1 is no more. XTO got acquired and left. DR Horton, a lot of these companies have left, and there really hasn't been much that's risen through the ranks as far as a homegrown company that have replaced those jobs, replaced that innovation. But then on the flip side of that coin, we've had some really amazing, in a startup world, we call it an exit, where a company liquidates, they sell, they go public, something like that. So literally for each one of the last 5 years, we have had a big biotech exit in Fort Worth. Going back to Encore Vision in, I think, 2016, they sold for $500 million. The up next after that was two guys that came out of Mucinex, which most people don't realize Mucinex was started right here in Fort Worth. Wow. By my friend John Adams. His two chief lieutenants started a company called ZS Pharma that exited for $2.7 billion. And nobody in Fort Worth knows that story. Here's a big biotech success that nobody knows. And so this is part of the reason we started the podcast, the Innovate Forward podcast, is because nobody knew these stories. Nobody knew the impact that innovation entrepreneurship was having. There was also no data around this. And so this is where we just kind of jumped in and started collecting some data on this subject, because as I looked around at the Fort Worth Chamber, a lot of chambers have a research arm. Fort Worth Chamber does not. The Dallas Regional Chamber does, but they focus on the entire DFW area. So there wasn't really anybody drilling down on just Fort Worth or just Tarrant County. Similarly, at the city level or economic development, I saw some sort of rudimentary things that people were collecting, but it didn't really give us a sense of the health of our high growth entrepreneurial ecosystem. So that's some of the data that we decided to look into and where we decided to see if we could find a need and fill it.
Yeah. What are maybe like one or two of the places in the current landscape of Fort Worth that you are and your team are looking at and targeting is like, this is where we want to see or help make something happen in the next year or two?
I mean, I think there's probably two or three ways I could answer that question. One is the piece I just mentioned, which is just general awareness, right?
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs are super important to our economy. We've got great ones here in Fort Worth. Everybody from Carrie Crow at Melt Ice Cream, who's running a really cool operation, to these biotech pharma guys that are doing really high, advanced innovation, cutting edge research, and they're turning that into the companies that help patients cure diseases, speed up healthcare processes. And so I think, biotech is definitely someplace that I think we have a much bigger impact than anybody realizes. Yeah. And now I know I realize I'm coming from a medical school, but our Cowtown Angel Group funds a lot of biotech. And an angel investor is usually just a high net worth individual who wants to invest in some early stage startup activity. Typically at the end of their career, they've retired, they sold their company. And Cowtown Angels has a reputation for being really good at investing in biotech. Similarly, we have Tech Fort Worth, run by Hayden Blackburn, who's fantastic. Probably about 60 to 70% of his clients at any one time are somewhere in the biotech space. So we have this, all the pieces are here. It's just a matter of, telling the stories, putting them together, and then helping each one of these companies along their own entrepreneurial journey.
Well, one of your biggest takeaways is around, I know we have Cowtown Angels, but one of your big takeaways here in your research is that we're the 13th largest city, but we rank 40th in early stage capital funding. And our deal flow is a lot lower than traditional, maybe Austin, where people are familiar with as you see startups coming out of. What impact or ramifications do you think that can have on our growth moving forward, to talk about all the great things that Fort Worth does really well and how this could even launch us into a national discussion for other startups and other innovators to change the statistic?
Yeah, great question. And let me back up a second, because I do think the research is important here. Again, because we don't know this as a city, right? We don't talk about this. You're not sitting in a coffee shop and you're hearing that kind of Silicon Valley talk going on in the background.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Cowboys or the Horned Frogs or what you're watching on Netflix, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just we don't have that culture and that vibe here like you do in some other cities, Austin included. So this all started the first of last year. I got access to a proprietary database called PitchBook. And basically I convinced some folks in our library that we needed this because it was really expensive. And so we jumped into PitchBook, and I hired this dynamite intern over the summer, a guy named Trent Barron. And I said, hey, Trent, we got this great resource. I need you to help me kind of be the eyes and ears on the research on this. Here's what I want to know. And so I gave him 5 or 6 different research questions, and he just tackled them in spades throughout the summer. So our first thesis was, so Fort Worth is the 13th largest city in the country, as you mentioned. Well, who are the cities bigger than us and smaller than us? And then how do we compare, right? So the first thing we figured out was, and let me back up too. So when we became the 13th largest city in the country, the city of Fort Worth is now larger than the city of San Francisco, which is just kind of mind-boggling, right? You think that Fort Worth is now bigger than the largest city in Silicon Valley. Now, The Bay Area as a whole, if you throw in San Jose and Cupertino, it's bigger. But still, I think that's an important bellwether for us to consider. So we looked at the data, and Fort Worth does about $17 million a year of early stage funding. So these are investors, venture capitalists, angels, or what they call a seed round. And we did a very inclusive definition of this. We did seed, which is usually where that's where you get started. Your angel, usually like maybe a second round. And then what would you call an institutional round, or a Series A, Series B, Series C of venture capital. So very inclusive definition. So Fort Worth does $17 million a year of this, and we compared ourselves to the 2 cities larger than us, 11 and 12, and the 2 cities behind us, San Francisco, Columbus, Ohio, Austin, and Jacksonville, Florida. And what we found out was we were pretty much behind in every category. No matter how we sliced it and broke it up, we were behind. So as I start sharing some of these initial findings around Fort Worth, what I realized is nobody really cares about Jacksonville. Yeah. Nobody really cares about Columbus. They care about how we stack up against other Texas cities, and they really only care about that one that's about 30 miles to the east of us. That's really the only one that they care about. So let me just run you through some of these numbers then with that in mind. So So Fort Worth, again, early stage capital raised in the last 5 years, on average, has raised about $17 million a year. And these are startups that are based in Fort Worth. This is where they're headquartered, right? This is not where the money is coming from. This is where the companies are based. So Dallas does about $236 million a year in early stage funding, which is about 14 times more. And Austin, we know Austin's a big software tech capital. Austin does $673 million, or 40 times more. And Austin's not that much bigger in population.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we also boiled it down on a per capita basis. So if you adjust for population and divide those numbers by the total population, because all the other Texas cities that I'm going to mention, San Antonio, Houston, Austin, and Dallas, they're all bigger than Fort Worth. But if you divide that out on a per capita basis, in Fort Worth, as an entrepreneur, you can expect to raise about $17 for your startup. Dallas, 176. Austin, 702.
Wow.
So if you're an entrepreneur, it makes a ton of logical sense for you to move to Austin because you have a much better chance of raising money if that's the kind of startup that you're pursuing. So those are just a couple of stats that were really shocking to us, that this is not something we've been paying attention to in Fort Worth very much. And it's I've kind of made it my new mission to just get the word out and say, I'm not real sure how to fix this, but before this, nobody had any of this data. We weren't thinking about this or talking about this. Now it's time for the city as a whole to have that discussion.
Yeah, and I think some of the other data that y'all found, looking in just Tarrant County specifically, per capita, South Lake is at $325 per capita, with Fort Worth at 17 being the smallest of the major municipalities in Tarrant County. And so it's not even comparing that we're trailing Dallas and Austin. We're trailing South Lake, Westlake, and Bedford, which I don't even know what to say about that. Like that, those are not the places that we think of comparing Fort Worth to in any way.
Yeah. And you can't get too hung up on some of those per capita numbers because look, South Lake, Bedford, they border Fort Worth, right? A lot of those people, they live in Fort Worth. They eat in restaurants in Fort Worth. So that's like good for the whole area. And they have a whole lot less people. The reason Westlake ranks so highly is nobody lives there. And so, if you're in an office, you just have a really low denominator in that equation. So you don't want to get too hung up on that. But here's another way to compare us that I think will also kind of at least hopefully inspire some people, if not make us think. So you mentioned that Fort Worth is the 13th largest city in the country, a little over 900,000 people, but we rank 40th in early stage funding. So of those numbers, that 17 million, that ranks us closer to Bakersfield and Louisville and Omaha and Albuquerque. So Omaha and Albuquerque actually raised more early stage capital than Fort Worth does.
Wow.
And if you break it out by different categories that I mentioned, seed, angel, series A, we're about 40th in all those categories as well. We rank a little bit higher in the angel capital raised, but we're in that kind of low 30s, early 40s ranking. And then here's another way to think about this. So I asked my intern, Trent, I said, okay, well, what would it take to get us to the next level? All right. So if we're ranked 40th now, how do we get to 30th? How do we get to 20th? And how do we get to where we should be, which is 13th, right? Because that's how many people we have. So he said to get to 30th, it would take 2.7 more capital, 2.7 times more capital, or 151 million more. To get to 20th, it'd be 7x, or 565 million more. And to punch at our weight as the 13th largest city in the country, to rank 13th, get ready for this, it'd be a 16x increase, or 1.3 billion. And here's the problem with that too, is those other cities are going to stop raising money, right? So that number is probably just going to continue to go up over time. Now, here's the thing I want to say too, this is not all about venture capitalists. More venture capital is not the answer, but it's just a really clear picture that we have not been funding the startups that healthier, more well-known, bigger entrepreneurial ecosystems have in the country.
And why do you think that? What is your when you think about the reasoning why we lag behind? What do you conclude in your opinions?
I think it's a really good question, and one I've pondered many times. It's I think we don't have a risk tolerance for stuff like that. We are more than willing to make a bet on a oil well in West Texas, right? We're going to we'll drill holes in the ground all day long. That's really no more or less risky than a tech startup. It's just a very different kind of business. And it's something that I think is very different than, even biotech, right? I think a lot of people in this town are just kind of afraid of biotech because of the science. And so they don't invest in that. And it's not that Fort Worth is any more or less generous or risk taking. It's just, this has not been a category that we have really focused on. I also think we're a big real estate town. So we love buildings. We love real estate, but we don't always take some of that expertise, that knowledge, and shift it towards these new guys, these entrepreneurs, this high risk type of investments.
Yeah. I mean, on top of that question, what about also when you present this to leaders in Fort Worth and government officials and institutions? What is their response to it? Because we at Fort Worth, we're proud of how great our city is, and a lot of things are going right. So when you present this to people, what is the first response that you usually get?
I think it's a little bit of shock and awe, like, oh, I didn't know that. I'm really glad you looked into that. And then the next question is the same one you asked, which is, okay, well, how do we fix it? And, and I think also too, it's not just about the capital, right? It's not just about the dollars. It's about developing the overall ecosystem. And let me just give you another couple of stats here that I think are really interesting. According to PitchBook, so this resource this proprietary resource that we got all this data from, Fort Worth only has one venture capital firm. That's Bios Partners. They're in biotech, so that kind of makes sense, right? But to be the 13th largest city in the country and only have one venture capital firm, seems like somebody's missing out on some opportunity here. And that's not to say that PitchBook is 100% accurate. A lot of family offices or high net worth individuals, they kind of function as a venture capital firm. They just don't call themselves that. One other thing that I think is interesting too is that in Fort Worth, we don't have any true accelerator programs. And let me define that for a minute. An accelerator program is kind of like an incubator, which is what I would call like Tech Fort Worth or IdeaWorks. But it's not, but an accelerator has two key differences. One is that it's time bound. So it's usually a 3 to 4 month program that culminates in a demo day where you bring in a bunch of venture capitalists and investors and you see the pitches and then people write them checks, hopefully. But we also don't have, and the other key indicator is there's some sort of an investment. So Tech Fort Worth would never make an investment in a company just because that's not how they're set up. But these accelerator programs like Y Combinator is a famous one, Techstars, 500 Startups, they don't have a program here in Fort Worth. Capital Factory has them in Dallas. Dallas just got another one called Founders Institute, just announced last week. Dallas has got tons of these. And Fort Worth officially has 0, which I think means we're the largest city in the country that does not have a true accelerator program.
Wow.
It's pretty, I feel like it's almost a consistent thing with a lot of, that you hear from a lot of people that move to Fort Worth from other large cities is, I'm so used to being able to have this experience or this type of restaurant or this type of thing to do. And Fort Worth doesn't have it. And it just sort of waits for somebody to come along with the inspiration to do it and the means to get the finances to do it. It almost feels like it lines up with that sort of thing of, wait, why don't we have that? And do we just sit around it and wait for somebody to come and start these things? Or is that something that is part of your position, is having these conversations like, hey, why are you not part of one of these? Or why doesn't one of these exist in Fort Worth? Because it almost feels like in a lot of ways we're just sort of waiting until somebody says, yeah, like Fort Worth needs that, I'll start it.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And EJ, another way to answer your question is when I put some of this research out on Twitter, I got a great message back from a local entrepreneur. And he said, I've been working on this problem for 10 years, and I've just decided that Fort Worth just can't get out of its old ways enough to ever move the needle on this sort of thing. And so I tweeted him back and I just said, hey, I really appreciate your thoughtful comment on this, but I'm not giving up. I think there's some more stuff that we could do. And I had that experience when I first moved back to town, and people had no idea what I was talking about. And then 3 years later, something shifted and everybody was like, oh, you need to meet this guy. And you talk to that guy and he loves innovation, and talk to this entrepreneur. And I mean, I just see a version of Fort Worth where we have to pick up this third leg of the economic development stool, or we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be nothing more than a bedroom community to Dallas, where people love living in Fort Worth and they hate driving to Dallas every day for work. So I do think it is a problem where we've got to take some leaps. We've got to take some risk. And I think that the philanthropy community has to play a role in this too. We are great at funding the ballet. We are great at funding the zoo. I love the zoo. I take my kids there all the time. But that doesn't really lead to economic development that entrepreneurship can bring. That's not going to cure diseases. That's not going to bring the next innovation to market that we didn't even know we needed yet.
Yeah.
And so there's also this notion of like venture philanthropy, right? You can make an investment to whoever your favorite charity is. You get a tax write-off. Everybody's good. Or you can take some of that same capital with pretty much the same risk tolerance and try to invest it in an early entrepreneur or in a promising technology that will help create jobs and move the needle in ways that just straight up philanthropic dollars that get a tax credit never can. Yeah. And so I'm really curious to see how Fort Worth could, utilize that community. In Kansas City, for instance, you had the Kaufman Foundation. He devoted $2 billion. Well, it was $800 million when he died in '93, and it's grown to $2 billion to education and entrepreneurship. The two things that he thought gave him a leg up and allowed him to grow this huge company that employed thousands of people. Also in Kansas City, there's a guy, Barnett Helzberg. You guys heard of Helzberg Diamonds? Mm-hmm. So he sold his company to Warren Buffett, and he started the Helzberg Entrepreneurial Mentoring Program. That's right, hemp. Yeah. And he has a great way to give back to the entrepreneurial community in Kansas City, because guess who his mentor was? Mr. Kaufman. And so he basically has seeded some programming to help the next generation of entrepreneurs, because that's what set him apart. And we just don't really have that in Fort Worth. We don't really have that, those kind of equivalent programs that you can point to outside of the universities.
Yeah, I was actually going to think about, I'm blanking why I'm blanking on his name right now, but the director of entrepreneurship at TCU, I was talking to him about the MBA program, and I feel like obviously when you look at successful startups, a lot of this is young, vibrant people with creative ideas who hustle, who live off of shoestring budgets. They really sacrifice and put in some time. And so UT Austin plays a big kicker to Austin's success. Stanford and the Sand Hill Road and all that stuff, like that area played a piece to their success. And so when I look at TCU's ecosystem, their MBA program is usually a bunch of people who are getting paid by these oil and gas companies to come get an MBA. And so they're really just here to get the MBA and then get a pay raise as now an executive at an oil and gas company because the company paid for it. And so I was truly exploring the MBA program because I was just curious. And that was he kind of said that. He's as an entrepreneur, I don't know if this would be your wheelhouse to go to TCU's MBA program, because it's a lot of oil and gas and just executives who are looking to move up. So what is your thoughts and response, the responsibility that university partnerships have as well as these philanthropies in the ecosystem?
Man, lots to unpack there. So I can hit that from multiple vantage points. So first off, the MBA was created to create middle managers in big companies, right? And a lot of these companies have taken on, or a lot of these MBA programs have taken on an entrepreneurship slant, right? Because you got to know a lot of that stuff when you're starting your company. You guys know that, right? As local entrepreneurs in Fort Worth. But there's so much of starting your own company that's just learned by doing that you just kind of have to get started. So that's where a lot of my focus has been on things like Startup Weekend, where you literally start companies in the course of a weekend. We got another one coming up in Fort Worth in November. And then you figure out real fast, man, this is the greatest weekend of my life. I can't wait to start. I don't want to have to go back to my day job. Or, you know what, that was fun. I learned a lot, but I'm not cut out for this. I'm happy to go back to my day job, right? And that's a perfectly acceptable answer, right? Because not everybody is made for this. Starting a company is probably the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life. And if you are not ready for that, you don't have the stomach for it, then you're not going to be successful. You've got to be passionate about it, and you've got to really literally put just about everything on the line in order to make that happen.
Yeah.
Now, as far as the role the universities play, I think it's a critical role because we do a ton of research, and TCU is less of a research institution, and they're private. So there are two really main differences versus what they do and what we do. But so many startups come out of this university-led, federal government-funded research that you then discover things in a lab, and then you're able to take those things to market. I've got a front row seat on a guy named Sid O'Brien. He's our top-rated researcher at the Health Science Center. That's really one of the world's leading experts in Alzheimer's. And he would punch me if I said that, but he's legit. And he just got a $45 million grant to study the effects that Alzheimer's have on the Hispanic population. And that has led to a university spin out based on his technology using blood biomarkers to detect Alzheimer's in a company called CX Precision Medicine. And you'll hear a lot more about that company probably in the next couple of years. But there's a direct link there between the ability of the entrepreneur or the researcher to give his technology, license it out to an entrepreneur to let them take it to market and to let them bring it to patients, literally. So there's a huge role for universities to play is that seed of innovation. And again, economic development is part of our mission. And so we want to make sure that we create the jobs of the future, that we seed new products and services and try to help them get to market in any way we can. It drives me crazy that we do so much basic research that never has a chance to ever make it to a patient or an animal or the market or anything. And I want to make sure that we commercialize as many of these kind of technologies as we can.
I think that there's so much to chew on in this. I feel like, just to.
I have a question around. I always feel like when I'm on a plane in DFW, someone works for like private equity or an LP in Forth. I'm like, where are these people? And like, so like, maybe we're not the venture capitalists, but is TCU's endowment, is UT Science Center's endowment, are these philanthropies endowments giving it to other VCs out there outside of Fort Worth? Is that a potential thing that we know about, or is that something that's still very unknown? I guess is where I'm curious about.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of an unknown, and frankly, it's something I want to look into a little bit more because what the research we've done so far is all based on where the company is based, right?
Yeah.
So if your address line is Fort Worth, that's what we counted. But there's also this notion of what an economist would call like a capital outflow. So what about capital here, and where is that capital being invested, right? So if there's a high net worth individual, a hedge fund, a private equity firm, and they do exist here in Fort Worth, where is that capital actually going? And we looked into the PE stuff a little bit, so private equity, and it is remarkable how little of the capital that is based here stays here. And we're talking very few deals over time. And private equity tends to be your growth capital. That's your higher level. That's your later in the business stage type of capital. But it's also super important. Those guys can sometimes play acquirer of technologies. There's another role for like big companies to play. So like if I have a railroad technology that's super cutting edge, I need BNSF to seed that research, and then I need them to acquire me, right? So then there's more companies that get started, more innovation that happens. And those guys just aren't playing in this ecosystem at all. And I don't mean to call it BNSF, but it could be Lockheed or Bell or American Airlines or any of these other big companies that just aren't really seeding things in Fort Worth. Lockheed Ventures, for instance, like they have a venture arm. It is their job to go out and find new cutting edge technologies that Lockheed can license or acquire. I've never met a Lockheed Ventures person in Fort Worth ever. And we have like 10,000 employees out on the west side of town.
So true.
So like, I know those guys exist. They're just not here looking for deals.
Yeah. Well, what is your, I think this would be kind of a great kind of final up question around what is your advice to people? Because I feel like millennials, young people, I even think about the people in our organization, all of our college kids who work for us. Entrepreneurship sounds sexy. Raising capital sounds sexy. You go to these TCU kids. We actually, Brad Hancock is, by the way, who I was thinking about. Is that right?
Love Brad.
Yeah.
Brad is fantastic. He has since retired, but yes, Brad's amazing.
Yeah, and Rodney Souza is the new entrepreneur director who I was speaking with, who is also great. But they have actually a very strong CEO organization, which is the National Collegiate Entrepreneurs Organization. So it's a CEO college, and TCU actually has a very strong group. So I say all this what is your advice to people who might only have $17 per person in their city, doesn't have an accelerator in their city, only has one VC firm in their city, but they have an idea. They want to be the next unicorn. What is your advice to these people if they want to also choose to stay in Fort Worth?
So I think the first advice is go work for a startup, get startup experience somehow. Because again, you're going to figure out if you like it or if you don't. But it's also a perfectly acceptable career path to go work in a big company, right? So one of the myths of entrepreneurship is that it's this 22-year-old Mark Zuckerberg character that's sitting in his dorm room at Harvard. We've all seen the movie, right?
Yeah.
But that's actually not the norm. The norm is someone who is of an average age of about 39 and 41. They've got some money in the bank. They've got a decade, maybe two of experience working in a company, and they see a problem, right? My boss at the Health Science Center, Mike Williams, describes entrepreneurship as the act of solving complex problems. And that's exactly what entrepreneurs do. They see a problem and then they go figure it out. So whether you're working in insurance or at Lockheed Martin or wherever, you probably see problems all day long that you think you could solve. And I'd say it's interesting. We're in this recession right now caused by coronavirus and crashing oil prices and all that. But one of the greatest things for entrepreneurship is a recession, because people start companies coming out of a recession. They get that pink slip, they cash in their 401k, they take that thing they've been coding at night on the side and they turn it into a real app finally. They take that little thing they've been tinkering with in their garage and they try to take it to market. And those are the companies that can launch and really change society and can really add to economic growth. So here's another little stat for you. Half of today's Fortune 500 companies were started during a recession or a bear market. So my big question for Fort Worth is, who are those companies that are going to start in this horrible, horrible time that are going to end up becoming the next Ubers, Airbnbs, Pinterest? All those were started in 2008 or 2009 out of the Great Recession. And those companies completely changed human behavior, right? It's a very different world now that you can spend the night on someone's couch, that you can get into a complete stranger's car and they'll take you to the airport. So those startups really changed human behavior. And there's no reason to think that Fort Worth can't have the exact same ability to start companies like that, just like they did in Silicon Valley and wherever those companies were started. I want to take, EJ, if I can, I want to take the jobs question first, because I want to ask you guys, we've got some research coming out later this year. How many jobs do you think in Tarrant County are started every year by firms less than 1 year old? The true definition of a startup, right? I was not a company yesterday. I'm a company today, between today and this time next year.
I would
shout
say
out a number. What do you think it is?
I would say it's super low. So by a percentage, like the percentage of new jobs year over year, like that are started. I mean, can I say like 5% of new jobs are from jobs that are new businesses being started? Is that a fair way?
I almost feel like that's too high. I think closer to maybe like. I mean,
here's a great example. You started your business,
maybe 2,500 to 3,000 jobs in the next year. I feel like maybe that number is even. Well, I feel like it's really low.
I think about like Granbury, right? You're a year, right? A year anniversary was.
Yeah.
So you hired some people at Granbury Theater. Like, how many of yous do you think exist that are starting new jobs for people?
I mean, I can think of like between restaurant, service industry, I can think of 25 to 35 maybe off the top of my head. And let's say that they average somewhere between 10 and 15 jobs a place. Yeah. You're looking
750
to, yeah. Yeah, and I feel like that's more of the ecosystem that we hear about is these the service
smart,
industry, like restaurant type of places. So I feel like it is a very low number.
So I love that discussion because that's exactly the kind of discussion I have every day. Like, well, what about this? And what about that? But here's the answer, right? And we got the answer coming out, like I said, in a more comprehensive study later this year. So, but let me put it in context first. So the Fort Worth Chamber, and I don't mean to call them out. This is a reference point, right? When they released their Fortify strategy a few years ago, their goal was to start or to create 2,000 jobs and to import or attract 2,000 jobs over a 4-year period of this plan, right? So they're talking about 1,000 jobs a year in those two categories. Well, here's the number. In 2018, which is the most recent data that we have, firms 0 to 1 years old created 25,157 jobs. And that number has been pretty standard over the last 5 years before that we looked at. Now, EJ, to your question, that only represents 3% of total employment. What it doesn't account for, because I got to get a better data set, it doesn't account for all of the jobs that big companies destroy, because big companies actually destroy more more jobs than they create. So total employment in Tarrant County in 2018 was 850,000 plus. But firms 0 to 1 year old created over 25,000 of those jobs.
Wow.
Yeah.
So new companies are super important to job creation. And, you hear this in the political world, and you hear this by candidates and things like that. What really matters is the age of the company, not the size of the company. Small business is the backbone of the American economy. Yeah, there's a lot of people that get employed in small businesses. They're great. We need those. But the job creation really comes from the new companies, the new startups.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. And I think it's going to be super helpful for the people who listen and want to impact this part. If you want to be a part of the Fort Worth discussion, I also know you have Global Entrepreneurship Week coming up as well, and some things. What are other ways that people can get involved if now they're excited from this news and this information and like, okay, I want to be a part of this. I want to do more into this space. What are some things they could latch onto?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the first one. I neglected to answer your question about Linux Academy. Yeah, so we started the Innovate Fort Worth podcast, which is a way that we try to highlight local innovators and entrepreneurs. If you can find it anywhere you get your podcast, have a listen. What I always tell people is, if you don't know who the entrepreneurs are that are operating in your city, then you don't know how to help them. So listen to these episodes and see if there's a way you can plug in and help them. The second thing is, there's a lot of local events that happen for entrepreneurs all the time. It's been a tough world with COVID, of course, but Global Entrepreneurship Week is coming up the week before Thanksgiving in November. So November 16th through 20th. Last year we had 52 different events in 35 different locations. This year, unfortunately, it's all going to be virtual, but that also means we can bring in some really amazing speakers from around the country that don't have to get on a plane, fly here, have to pay to come, get a hotel room, all that. They can just sit at their desk in their pajamas, and we can get venture capitalists from Silicon Valley and policy leaders from DC to give us 30 minutes or an hour of their time to talk to us. So go to gewfortworth.com if you want to learn more. And there's also a thing called 1 Million Cups every Wednesday morning. You can go and hear from 2 local startups, not so you can exploit them, not so you can figure out a way to mess with them, or you have to write a check, just so you can help them. Hey, I know a guy who would really like that service, or I know a guy who would make a great X, right? You need a chief technology officer. I know a friend who just got laid off, but he'd be great for you, something like that. So
that's cool.
That's just some great ways to plug in. And yeah, Tech Fort Worth, they run Tech Nest every Tuesday night. That'd be a great way to plug in. So lots of different opportunities. One last one that kind of aggregates these is called Sparkyard. This is a brand new resource that's been out about a year, and we're trying to aggregate all of the resources that are available for entrepreneurs, particularly the nonprofit stuff, because entrepreneurs just don't know where to turn, right? You got your rich Uncle Joe and you got your friend who's kind of a crazy startup guy, but how do you connect into the resources at a much larger level? And that's what Sparkyard can help you with, help you point you in the right direction, help you get the right resource for your startup at the right time in your development. So there's a few ways that you can plug in, and it's going to take all of us. This is not a problem you can solve. It's not a problem I can solve. We all got to work together, which is something Fort Worth happens to be really good at.
Love it.
Yeah, I think that's a great spot to end. We really appreciate you sitting down with us today. We're excited to talk to you more and continue to see how Fort Worth hopefully pushes the envelope and trending the right direction in this.
Very important work.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on. Again, it's a pleasure to be on your show. Love what you guys are doing. And look forward to many more episodes.